Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Please take a moment to like this week's episode and to click on the subscribe button. And if you'd like to be reminded of upcoming episodes, click the bell icon.
So each week, if you're new to this show, Todd, Leonard, and I take a moment to talk about the lectionary readings for the upcoming weekend from the Gospels. And our goal is to talk about those passages in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. Our hope is that our conversation, our talking will be just, as in justice, but that also will inspire you alongside with us to do more than just talking. So, Todd, what passages are we looking at this week?
So, yeah, we got two this week tied to Easter, both speaking about the resurrection.
Happy
And
Easter, by the way.
yeah, happy Easter. Happy, we're recording this on Monday, Thursday. Um, And so for the resurrection
So, which is it,
Easter.
Monday or Thursday?
Oh,
Sorry,
nice.
don't. Sorry, I'm sure
He's
that
here
joke
all
has been
week, ladies
told
and gentlemen.
a million times. Sorry.
Um, whew. Um,
I just got myself fired.
so the passages that we're looking at are John 20 verses 1 through 18 and Mark 16 1 through 8.
So, you got any thoughts on Mary and Jesus and the gardener and Peter and John and that whole passage in John first tonight?
It's my thing about John, as we will try not to spend much time going after John tonight. And it's easier not to go after John tonight because this passage seems kind of
Oh, it's great.
un-John like.
Right, right.
Because it
It's
seems
the
like John
exception to
is,
the rule.
yeah, because it seems like in most places, John is wanting people to believe in this Jesus knowledge and believe that Jesus is this pathway into the invisible realms, and and almost that our goal is to be disconnected from our physical bodies, and so it would seem like for John, it would he would only be concerned with that Jesus had transcended bodily existence and moved on. But in John 20, he goes way out of the way with an extensive narrative about Mary,
The most
about John
extensive
and
out of all the four.
right of proving a physical resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. Even John shifts as he gets to this story.
One thing I like about these closing chapters of John's gospel is the shout out. At the time that this was written, there were different communities within the Jesus movement that were vying for power and authority and just significance, just standing, just that, justify their existence even. And you got the folks that followed after Thomas. He's mentioned, in the next
Mm-hmm.
chapter, and kind of shout out given to him, legitimizing that
Hmm.
community. In this chapter, we get three communities. You get the community that's represented by the Johannine community, which is the disciple Jesus loved, and then you've got the those who represent or who respected the apostleship of Peter, that community. But and this can't go unmentioned, you have most of the stage time in this
Right.
story given to Mary, which would have been a huge affirmation to the community that recognized the apostleship of Mary and her
Right.
authority in the early church.
Yeah. I mean, this is Mary in the starring role,
Yeah.
and doesn't get this coverage anywhere else in the Gospels. This is a major highlighter, and yeah, it represents obviously uh, uh, what John was, or the writers of John were seeing as credible communities at the time that John was put together, that clearly she had a following.
Hmm. And as much as I bag on early proto-Gnosticism in the Christian church or in the early Jesus movement, and bag on it in John's gospel especially, one of the things that the Gnostics got right over the others, that the other groups failed in, while the others were moving in a more patriarchal
Mm-hmm.
direction, the Gnostics were pretty egalitarian.
Right.
There was a lot of, and seeing this honor given to Mary and her community is a token of that. You know, it's really beautiful to see for those of us who were raised in faith traditions that still struggle with egalitarianism versus
Mm-hmm.
patriarchy. It's really beautiful to see in the Gospel of John that it comes down on the side of egalitarianism.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anything else on John before we jump to Mark?
Um. Nope.
Okay, all right. So, Mark, I had a new thought with Mark this time as we rolled around this Easter season. Something that I learned from, let's see if I can, I wasn't prepared again, Todd. I know that comes as a shock to everyone.
It's because you got it all in your head. You don't. You don't need. You're not a man who needs the book. He does. You don't need any notes. You're just all in your
See,
head.
this is my problem, is that I got too much in there. Okay, so I'm going to find the author. Fiorenza? Does that sound correct?
Sure.
Anyway, feminist theologian who recently I was introduced to the idea of the timing in which these New Testament documents were being written. And there's a significant amount of evidence that says the Gospel of Mark was being written at a time where the patriarchy was just gaining momentum in the
Mm.
early Jesus movement. And this was the time when the pseudo epistles of Paul were being written, like Timothy, where it tells women to uh, be quiet and to, I don't allow a woman to have authority over a man. She must be silent. And again, there were all kinds of patriarchal influences in the early Jesus movement. We find them in Paul, in the Corinthians, where Paul tells women to learn at home or to be silent. So all
Mm-hmm.
of these emphasis, um, these voices saying, these patriarchal voices trying to silence the voices and presence and authority and power of women in the early Jesus movement. I think it's interesting that the Gospel of Mark is so unique that it actually gives us a version of the resurrection story and what the resurrection story would have looked like if women had been silent. Because it ends with, these only the women are named in Mark's
Mm-hmm.
resurrection story. Only
Mm-hmm.
the women are given the good news from the angel at the tomb. Only the women are experiencing this. And then it ends with trembling and bewildered. The women went out and fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So the
Mm-hmm.
women were silent. So what would have happened if people obeyed Timothy and people who listened to the Corinthian letter
Yeah.
and said, women we wouldn't have had the message of the resurrection. I think
Right.
it's a subtle dig. There's a lot of evidence out there too that the Markan gospel was written by a community of women Jesus followers. There's that
Hmm.
theory out there, and I don't know that that's ever been proven, but it's one of the theories that's out there when you look at, and there is some evidence for that. But I just think it's fascinating to hear that this is a gospel. All of the resurrection stories are so different. And we
Yeah.
see contrasted this week the very first one in our gospels that was written and the last one in our gospels that was written. John's is way more detailed, still gives honor to Mary, but Mark gives honor to the women voices in the early church, maybe in a subtly different way by saying, okay, fine. You want women to be silent? This is what would have happened had they been silent.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a cool thought.
It's
Any,
interesting. It is very interesting.
yeah, I could be totally wrong, but it's a cool thought. I think
Yeah.
it's a cool thought.
But it was clear that that the the heavenly messenger intended for them to deliver the message. So they're making it clear. Mark is making it clear that that was the intention, is that they would deliver the message, but then the writers say, but the
But they
women,
didn't.
because they were scared and because of
Yeah, yeah.
they held back. Yeah,
And the
that's
message
a
too,
intriguing idea.
the message too is that Jesus would go before them and that you'll meet him in Galilee, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and it's like the Matthean gospel. The Matthean is very Galilean centered.
Mm-hmm.
You get to Luke, and there's no message of going to Galilee. No, no, no. Stay right here in Jerusalem and let
Yeah,
the early church grow out of Jerusalem. So, there were two camps, there were two communities, one centered in Galilee, one centered in Judea, of Jesus followers, and each one had their version of the resurrection story. I just think all of that stuff is so interesting and fascinating.
yeah. When you don't have to try to make it all seamlessly fit together as if it was
Right.
all intentional, and allow the humanity of these passages as they're all wrestling with the implications and what they think God wants and versus and what they want, and what their prejudices are and what their biases are.
Yeah,
It's incredibly fascinating.
it is. It's a fascinating read through when you're not having to, as you said, make it all harmonious.
Yeah,
And you give it the
yeah,
freedom just to be what it is.
yeah. And maybe that's another good takeaway, uh, is is allowing these resurrection stories to be, and allowing the resurrection story in our time and place, allow it to be continue to be interpreted and contextualized and wrestled with within the various faith and non-faith communities who read these stories, that they continue to allow that story to speak contextually into what they're experiencing now, what they're facing now, what their struggles are, what their hopes and dreams are, as far as living out living towards a just world. That um, we can allow that freedom to be contextualized by the different communities who still value these stories.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a great segue into what I have a burden to talk about this week leading up to Easter, with Easter just right around the corner, coming this weekend. There were communities within the early Jesus movement that are recognized by their writings being added to the sacred canon. In other words, their legitimacy is is affirmed by their gospels being added. And I'm talking about Luke in the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm.
The community that recognized the book of Acts as the record of the early church, I find it fascinating too that this was one of those communities that didn't see the death of Jesus as the good news or the saving element in the story. The book of Acts, and I've got passages on top of passages. Acts 4, Acts 2, there's two of them in Acts 2, Acts 3. Did I say Acts 4 already? No, yeah, another one in Acts 4, Acts 5, Acts 10. I'm only going to read the one from Acts 13. It says, and we bring you the good news that what God promised to our ancestors, he has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising Jesus over and over again. And all of these passages in the book of Acts repeatedly, as the gospel is going forth to the world in the book of Acts, the gospel is not that Jesus died or that Jesus died for you or that Jesus died for anyone. The gospel is this Jesus whom the state executed, God has responded to by bringing back to life. He's undone, reversed, and overcome that execution by bringing Jesus back to life. And I find that to be way more life giving in our context today. It's one of the reasons why I argue that Christianity doesn't have to be a death cult. It's not
Right.
about celebrating Jesus's death. Death is the crucifixion is the enemy agent, the enemy element in the narrative here. And whatever we
Hmm.
make of the resurrection stories in our scientific worldview today, in the book of Acts, the good news is not that Jesus died, but that Jesus was raised.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it's just interesting to look at, because you have the books of the Christian scriptures that seem to focus more on his death as salvific, which would be the writings of John
And Paul.
and the writings of Paul. John's very much coming from influenced. It appears to be what would develop into Gnosticism, and then Paul seems to be very much trying to create a theology that makes sense to the Jewish cultic system, temple system, and that Jesus, in some ways, fulfilling um, the a mandate from to tie in to the whole temple system of sacrifice, um, and so it again, it seems like these other groups are trying to accomplish agendas, but Luke's writing, and Luke comes from a more the writers of Luke seem to come from a little bit more of a cosmopolitan Greek
Mm-hmm.
influenced place,
Mm-hmm.
and so their interest in the the life is the proof of the ongoing um, worthiness of following and following Jesus. That would be in line with where other thinking of that time was, and
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think it's very important again that you have these. Thank goodness the Bible is messy enough where the people who put the canon together didn't eliminate Luke and Acts, and as heavy as they were, and including Paul and John, they didn't give up. They continued to leave the Lucan and the Markan accounts and the Matthean gospel as well.
Yeah, I resonate so much with those gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that emphasize the resurrection as being the good news or the salvific element, the triumphant, the victory over the death,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the sections of the New Testament that try to, and none of them, this is what's so frustrating to me, none of them can agree as to how Jesus's death, if that's what was salvific, none of
Mm-hmm.
them can agree as to how it actually pulled that off. What did the death of Jesus accomplish? And that's why we have so many moral influence. I'm sorry, so many atonement theories, like the moral
Mm-hmm.
influence, like
Mm-hmm.
penal substitution, like Christus Victor. And there's all these different ways throughout Christian history where we've tried to explain how
Yeah.
Jesus's death saves us. And yet there's this community in the book of Luke, Acts, Matthew, and Mark that say, what if the death wasn't the saving thing? What if the
Right.
death doesn't save us? What if the death was the enemy's actions and God's action was not in the crucifying, but in the overcoming of that execution
Yep.
and bringing Jesus back to life? In other words, it's a message that love can conquer hate, that injustice can doesn't have the last word, that justice can triumph over injustice, that
Mm-hmm.
that that death doesn't have the last word, that which is life giving can overcome those things in our world that are death dealing. And that's a no matter how you scientifically resolve the resurrection stories, the story truth is one of life overcoming death dealing,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a that love of conquering hate. That's a story worth holding on to.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I find it also fascinating, Todd, that certain marginalized communities within various expressions of liberation theology, various liberation theologies, also resonate with not placing salvific meaning with
Mm.
the death of Jesus, but the resurrection of Jesus. And I know, once again, surprise, surprise, I've prepared 3 slides for our discussion from womanist theologians. If anyone is not familiar with womanism, womanism is not feminism. But here are some. Let me see if I can share my screen. I almost forgot how to share my screen. Boy, we must have been gone last week or something. All right, can you
Oh
see that?
yeah, we were off last week. Yeah. Okay.
I forgot how to do this. All right, so this is from Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, her book "Stand Your Ground: Black Bodies and the Justice of God," page 182 and 183. And I love this so much. This makes me so excited to read this. It says the resurrection is God's definitive victory over crucifying powers of evil. The impressive factor is how the cross, is defeated. It is defeated by a life-giving rather than life-negating force. So it's through resurrection, not crucifixion. God's power, unlike human power, is not a master race kind of power. And again, this is talking about racial justice. That is, it's not a power that diminishes the life of another so that others might live. And that's exactly how we've explained the message of the cross for too long. It
Mm.
says God's power respects the integrity of all human bodies and the sanctity of all life. And I would just add, including Jesus's. This is a resurrecting power. Therefore, God's power never expresses itself through the humiliation or denigration of another. It does not triumph over life. It conquers death by resurrecting life. The force of God is a death negating, life affirming force. Again, that's page 182 and 183. On the let me see if I can get to the next page here. This is on page 188, just a few pages later, same book. What the resurrection points to, however, is not the meaning of Jesus's death, but of his life. Now, in another book by Kelly Brown Douglas, she quotes Dolores Williams, and this is from her book, What's Faith Got to Do with It, page 90. And Dolores Williams, huge fan of, she has been relentless through the years of pushing back against those faith traditions within Christianity that try to find meaning out of Jesus's death. Dolores Williams writes, Jesus came for life and to show us something about life and living together and what life was all about. And then again from Dolores Williams in her book, Sisters in the Wilderness, The Challenge of Womanist God Talk. She writes, Christians cannot forget the cross, but neither can they glorify it. To do so is to glorify suffering and to render exploitation sacred. To do so is to glorify the sin of defilement. So, what I love the most about those passages is that idea that God, in saving in conquering death, or conquering rather the unjust death dealing forces of our world in the story, doesn't violate the bodily autonomy or the bodily sanctity or the value of life, even of Jesus. He doesn't save us through more death. You know, we're not
Mm-hmm.
saved from death
Mm-hmm.
by more death, even one more death. We're
Yeah.
saved from death by life. And that infusion of life was that resurrection act.
Yeah.
Anyway, especially with Easter coming up, I just wanted to make sure we spent some time at least offering this to those that might be prepping a presentation this weekend for Easter.
Yeah. I think it's. I think it's. I'm sorry. I had like 3 thoughts hit me at the same time, and I just froze. That's your screen is not buffering. That's me just freezing. Um,
Todd's buffering.
um,
Pick one at a
the
time, Todd.
yeah. So no, because I think it's been so easy, even on Easter weekend, for much of Christianity to celebrate the cross, and which is ironic because Easter is was set up and is celebrated on the day of the resurrection, and yet it shows how far a significant portion of Christianity has strayed, that they can't they don't have theology, they don't have good resurrection theology. They say is, and praise the Lord, he rose again.
And yeah,
But
it's just like an
salvation,
afterword.
but salvation happened with the cross,
Right.
and so the resurrection is just like, it's just like icing on the cake, but it's not the substance of the salvation story. And but the celebration of Easter was established, and Christians wrestling, trying to develop a cultic experience that was based on what they believe were the important things of Jesus, puts the resurrection at the heart of the celebration, and what those passages that you gave for us really start to give a good theological basis for why the resurrection is the salvific moment, is the real triumph
Hmm.
of
I
the
love
Christ
that.
story.
And there's so much evidence out there, Todd, that for the first millennia of Christian history, certainly there were those that didn't see it this way, but this was the main, this
Right.
was the, like there weren't cruces, there weren't, sorry, cruces. There weren't crosses, there weren't crucifixions, there weren't these,
Yeah.
as far as even in the art of the church,
Right.
the art of the
Right.
church was all about the
The
resurrected
resurrection.
Jesus or the good
Yep.
shepherd. The cross doesn't come up until the church takes a much darker turn in Christian
Mm-hmm.
history. We didn't emphasize that as salvific originally.
Yep.
It was all about resurrection and how the state had been overcome, the empire had been overcome.
Mm.
What were your other two thoughts? Do you remember? I'm so
I
curious.
don't. I don't.
All
Oh,
right.
one of them was just that you had mentioned in one of our recent episodes how you changed your ministry logo from a cross to the open tomb to
Mhm.
align with that story. That was just, it popped back in my mind again, and
It's been a significant focus change for me because I used to preach Christ and Him crucified, and I was a good Pauline Christian.
yeah.
But when you go back to the Jesus stories and you try to get inside the headspace of Jesus and not just preach a gospel about Jesus, but try to get into the headspace of Jesus and preach the same gospel he preached and emphasize the same things. I found that in my own experience, all the things that I was passionate about talking about, Jesus never mentions. And all the things that Jesus was passionate about, I never mentioned. Jesus,
Yeah.
except for John, Jesus is not represented in the uh, synoptic gospels, especially as placing salvific, meaning on his dying. He's only dying so that he can be resurrected, and it's the
Mm-hmm.
resurrection that really
Mm-hmm.
holds the meaning and the power.
Yeah.
That's what the game changer is.
Yeah.
But
So
yeah,
yeah.
so
All
happy
right, man.
Easter, everyone.
That's yeah. I hope everyone does have a good Easter, and
Whatever's going on in your life this weekend, the Jesus story doesn't end on Friday night. Yours doesn't have to either.
that's right. That's right.
That's not the whatever horrible thing is happening. That's not the end of the story.
That's right.
Not done yet.
Got any news for us?
I got a message from the the gentleman that's narrating my new book for Audible.
Hmm.
He is so excited about this book. Like every time he flipped the page and got to the next chapter, and every chapter he said it just kept getting better. He wants to come on our show and tell us about his experience with this book. I think
Oh,
that'd be a
wow.
cool idea.
That would be great.
Yeah, he
Oh,
wants
that's
to.
awesome.
Yeah. So that's way better than the last guy that had to bail
Right.
because it was too progressive for him. But this guy seems to be really excited about it. So yeah. So stay tuned to this channel. That show's coming up soon.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, and also the Jesus for Everyone podcast that I run each week. It is having a name change. It's updating to the Social Jesus podcast, and you'll be able to find it on Choircast, the network, the podcast network, run by my book publisher. And and if you're already subscribed to the Jesus for Everyone podcast, you won't really notice anything in your whatever platform you're listening to it on. You won't really notice anything except for a cover and title change. But for those that are looking for it, in a couple weeks, it's going to be titled the Social Jesus podcast. You'll be able to find it that way. But I think that's all the news I've got. My new
All
book is
right.
available at Amazon. That's it.
Okay. My wife and I are fostering 3 little kittens for a couple weeks. That's our news. Um,
Oh, how
yeah.
nice. I hope your
Hmm.
furniture survives it.
Yeah, I hope so too.
My
And
wife has this beautiful blue leather armchair that sits by our front door as you walk out, and it is just shredded by one of our cats who likes to let us know that it wants to go outside by just clawing that chair. It's just ruined. So I hope your
uh,
furniture survives the kittens.
yeah, yeah. Thanks. We'll keep you posted.
Please do.
So
The saga of the kittens.
yes. So all right, everybody. Great to be with you. We're hope you have a good Easter, and we will look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, everyone. See you then.